And then they say to us furthermore, you think of time as a progress, as something like a stairway or an ascending ladder that goes on and on and up and up. Maybe it has bumps in it where it occasionally goes down, but it's like a graph, you know, of a successful business corporation looks like this. See? That's how they want their graph to look. The Hindu says, you're absurd. The very thing you use for telling time is round. Don't you see? It just goes round. And so, look at the stars. Isn't everything going round? Aren't the galaxies going round? It is going round and round. It isn't going anywhere except round. And we say to them, oh, you poor Hindus, the trouble with you is that you don't have any technology. You have a terrible economy. Most of you are starving. And you think life is just terrible. And therefore, you have a pessimistic view of it. Well, that makes them laugh themselves silly. They have a pessimistic view. Well, the point is, we're not pessimistic because we know that the whole thing is a hoax. We know who we really are. And you poor Westerners, you're bug-eyed. You rush around with long noses. You have deep-set eyes. And you go poking your noses into everything. You send out missionaries because you are so uncertain of your own opinions that you have to convert everyone else to agree with you. And you're quite mad. But you live for the future. And poor suckers. All you do, of course, by living for the future is you create a great deal of trouble. Because you think you're involved in a process called history. Now here comes another, the very important matter, history. I've had the most amusing discussions with Orientals. And they have really no sense of history at all. For them, life goes around, and one year is pretty much the same as the next year. There are rhythms of birth and death. There are rhythms of rulers and revolutions and this and that, but they don't regard it as having some important progression in it. They have chronicles. At least the Chinese kept chronicles. But keeping chronicles is like keeping a diary or a daybook. It's a very different thing from writing history, where you're trying to make out some sort of sense in the course of events. Chroniclers just keep the records. And the Hindus didn't even bother to keep chronicles properly. So it's practically impossible to establish the date of a document from India, unless it was quite recent. Because every time they re-recited it or recopied it, they had to update the names. Because the king in it was an archetypal king. And every king is an example of the archetypal king about whom the story is told. All these Hindu scriptures are like our fairy tales. Once upon a time. Who knows when? 1,000,000 years ago? 20 years ago? It's all the same. Because the course of events and the rhythm is cyclic. So, we, on the other hand, from St. Augustine was the real troublemaker. I'm not absolutely sure that the Hebrews had a linear theory of time. It's questionable. They might have had one. Because they did look forward to the coming of the Messiah, to the day of the Lord, they had this apocalyptic idea that they were in such a wretched situation that there was going to come a day when the divine power would intervene in human events and set everything to right, and there'd be a head-knocking session called the Last Judgment, and everybody would be put in order. Well, what St. Augustine did with that, you see, he rejected the cyclic theory of time, not quite so much on account of the day of the Lord, coming at the end of time, but on account of the incarnation. He was somehow fixed on the idea that when Jesus was crucified, that was the one full, perfect, sufficient sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. It happened once. And if time is cyclic, he argued, this would have to happen again and again and again, and that couldn't be. Therefore, there is only one time, one progression of time, from the creation of the world through its redemption by the sacrifice of the cross and on to the final judgment. Then time would cease and we should be in eternity. And from this, theologians increasingly began to think about the historicity of Jesus and to emphasize that it was a historical fact and that history, as worked out in the Bible stories from the creation through the fall to the doings of Noah and Abraham and the captivity of the Israelites in Egypt and the giving of the law by Moses, all this was worked out as being the mighty acts of God which revealed the divine pattern for the course of human events. And the funny thing is that although many, many historians living today are not Christians and not Jews and don't believe in anything of that, they still think of history as a significant momentum towards progress, something that our children's children are going to get. We all suffered and lived for them. You're going to inherit this goodie down the end of the line. Now, we really don't know and can't talk about progress unless we know where we're going and are making progress towards that desired object. But most people involved in what they call progress haven't the faintest idea where they're going. I have found increasingly that businessmen and military men are astoundingly impractical. They just don't know what they want. They think they know. I had a long discussion with the Air Force strategic people, and they asked me and some other philosophers, what is your basis for moral behavior? So I pulled their legs and said, the basis for my moral behavior is pure selfishness. A very practical selfishness. Said, of course, I am talking like this because you're all hard-headed people. I'm not going to give you any sentimentality and stupid stuff about love and so on, because you face reality. You're a military man. And you have to see that the United States of America as a collective selfishness is properly looked after. Now, I said, of course, in my own personal life, when I'm selfish, I'm not too crude about it. I don't run around hitting people over the head and telling them, gimme, gimme, gimme. I pretend like I'm a public servant, that I'm out for their best interests and all that sort of thing, but that's camouflage. So then I said, now, the only trouble about this is that to be effectively selfish, you've got to answer two questions. The first is, what do you want? And the second is, what do you mean by yourself? Well, you know, that just pulls the carpet out from under everything. Because what do I want? Well, if I answer as a kind of a sensible human being, what do I want in life? The really important thing I've had from the beginning, which is that I'm an incarnation of the ground of being like everybody else. That's the most important thing, because you can't get rid of that. The next thing is, of course, I want food. I want friendship, companions, love, and general singing and dancing and so on. And these are more or less attainable material realities. But then I look at my very wealthy friends who ought to be able to have all these things, especially those who are extremely active in business, and I realize they don't have them. They're the most miserable people. Here, you're a great executive of a very, very important corporation. To begin with, you are drowned in paper. You do nothing but scan paper and make decisions about paper all day. You may be the director of an oil company. You never get within sight of oil, except when you drive your car. Mostly you're surrounded with statistics about oil, finances about oil, and you are smothered in this. And you have to spend almost all day in a wretched office building in a place like New York. You dress like a funeral director. I've had lunch at the board of directors of a very important oil company that shall be nameless. And it's like eating in a college cafeteria. The food was just, it was good food. It was extremely ordinary. But you would expect these great millionaires to be having caviar and glorious fish in aspic and wines and beautiful waitresses serving them and to be lounging at tables like Romans. No, sir. And then, if you've read an article in Look this week by Marshall McLuhan and George Leonard on sex, the future of sex, fantastic, brings up some information that what they call the narrow gauge specialized male, that is the sort of guy who gets out there and sells, and he mustn't have any feelings, because that would be unmanly to have any feelings, except he can have a kind of a gruff, but so many of these men are like that. And it says that role-playing of that kind of male gives you ulcers and all kinds of complaints, and is more deadly than facing the bullets in Vietnam. And they all die before their wives, because they are engaged in the pursuit of a completely fatuous goal. This fatuous goal is the future, and it is symbolized above all by money. They make lots of it, and having much more than they can even think about, and they have no idea what to do with it, except make more, except invest it in bigger and bigger units of something. And while they are harassed about that, and they're wondering about the antitrust boys, the Internal Revenue, their competitors, and all these ghouls who are involved in the game, they lie awake nights. They can't go home and throw the whole thing off. They have to get completely boozed. That's one way out. Or tranquilized, which is another way out. Or something or other, in order to take it. And they call themselves realists. You see, they're utterly unrelated to the physical universe. Well, this is partly, of course, because of the education they've received. You see, if you go to an ordinary school, such as we've had since the early 19th century, you discover that your education is purely cerebral. You are prepared to be an executive, a bureaucrat, some kind of clerk. You know, the word clerk originally means clergyman, because the clerics were the only people who were clever. The word clever, clear, clerk, cleric is all the same word originally in English. They were the literate people, and therefore they did all the bookkeeping and that kind of thing, the records. But they got away with it, you see, and they convinced us that the records and the bookkeeping is more important than the actual goods being transacted. So that now people, you see, are much happier with money than with wealth. Or think they are. Try to persuade themselves that they are. But they bought a lemon. So this guy, who thinks he works for the future, this great captain of industry, condemns himself mostly to misery. There are a few exceptions, naturally. As I said, I always exaggerate everything. I know a few important businessmen who have some conception of how to enjoy themselves. I was amused to meet a young one a little while ago who had created one big corporation which had been bought up by another of the biggest shows going today. He was a member of the board of directors, and he said, now, I'm 35 years old. I made an awful lot of money, and I'm going to drop out. So he took off for India. Well, then let's go and look. We've had a little look at business. Let's go and look at the military people. And they don't know what they want either. First of all, they invented a weapon which was completely insane, because it isn't a weapon. It's simply a contrivance for planetary suicide. And now a weapon is a very specific thing. Now a sword is a weapon. And notice it's pointed and sharp and directional. Because then you learn, first thing you have to know about using a sword is where to put it, where to point it. And so it is selective. But things like biological warfare, poison gas, and nuclear bombs are not selective. And you don't know when they're going to blow back on you or which way they're going, what the consequences of them are. The only thing you can do with them is you can pile them up and start lighting matches in the powder magazine. This is a very dangerous game that people might play with each other. Well, we're both sitting in a powder magazine, and I dare you to drop that thing, or, you know, we'll blow ourselves both up if you don't do what I want. Now, this isn't strategy, it's madness. Beyond that, they don't have any objectives. It would be understandable if we were going to Vietnam because of all those gorgeous little Oriental girls. We were going to capture the whole lot and bring them back here. But we're not. We are out to destroy something called communism. And nobody really can figure out what it is. Because if Russia is a communist country, all it is a one great big corporate business. It's one corporation instead of a cluster of corporations. And it works rather miserably. And I wouldn't think if you need to fight it, it'll just fall apart, because it's so boring. History of the thing, they were a lot worse when the brutal barons governed the country. And they are, you know, sort of better in a measly way, like in China. Things are pretty terrible ever since the British and their friends made a mess of China many years ago. And China's been an awful place. And things, again, in China are kind of dowdy and uniform and dull. But it's, so far as basic subsistence is concerned, it's probably better than it was. But my point is that we are fighting abstractions. For abstractions. Recently, the Congress of the United States passed an act against burning the American flag. Stiff penalties for burning the flag. And those same people who passed that act with a great flurry of patriotic speeches were actively burning up the country for which the flag stands. They are allowing every kind of scoundrelly use of the water, the air, the natural resources, and exploitation of the people, until the whole thing is being converted into a smog bowl. I flew not a few days ago from New York right across the country to Los Angeles, and from New York to Denver there was smog over the whole country, as far as I could see, from 30,000 feet. And this is America the Beautiful. You know, you burn up the flag is terrible. Burn up the country is quite okay. Because these people are confused, completely confused, between the symbolic world and the real world. And so this historical thing, you see, which is a destiny in the future, always being pursued, is completely destructive. Because technology, clocks, instruments, measurements are fine for people who know how to use them, people who know what they want. But for people who don't know what they want, and who think that the clock is the thing, you know. That's what you need. I mean, the Russians are insane about this. The moment they move into a place with their army that has some kind of technical civilization, they capture all the wristwatches in sight, and they cover themselves with wristwatches like bracelets, because they're time crazy too. But those things are very wonderful for people who, as I say, know how to use them.